Hi, thanks for joining me today for a second of context with Dr. Rosner. So, I'm guessing that most of you will know who this is. It's Benjamin Franklin, right? Yeah, it is, but I'm guessing that you probably don't know the greater context around Ben Franklin. Do you know who his sister-in-law was? Probably not. Her name was Anne Franklin, and she and Benjamin Franklin were responsible for keeping the paper, the New England Courant, in circulation when the publisher James Franklin went to jail for the assertion that he committed seditious libel. In fact, James Franklin had engaged in satire that critiqued the British crown, but that wasn't okay at this particular juncture in time. But here's the thing, a lot of women were working like Anne Franklin in the family apprentice model, but they weren't getting any of the credit. That was certainly the case for Anna Zinger when she worked at the New York Weekly Journal alongside her husband Peter, and he went to jail for also critiquing the government through satire, seditious libel, in 1734. Guess what? She worked really hard. She didn't get any of the credit. The same was really the case for Elizabeth Timothy and the South Carolina Gazette and publishers like Sarah and Mary Catherine Goddard of the Providence Gazette. In all, there are about 30 colonial women who are known to have been printers, publishers, or typesetters. They often ran the papers for their husbands, but in fact, they didn't get any of the credit. How might this be different from the experience of women today? Certainly, we've worked really hard in the journalism industry, just like these women. We get a lot more credit these days. We get bylines, we get space on broadcast television, we get space even in covering sporting events. But are we really equally represented in the news media? Don't we still encounter the glass ceiling? These are really important things to consider, and it's really important to understand the context. Now, let's continue. Ben Franklin, after he ran away from his brother James, he approached the publishing magnate, the Bradford family. Ultimately, he secured a position working for Samuel Keimer at the Pennsylvania Gazette. He worked up through that apprentice system alongside of his partner, Hugh Meredith, and he purchased the Pennsylvania Gazette. Here's the thing though, even though Ben Franklin had been an indentured servant himself, he was a part of the system in the colonial period of time in which so many Americans owned enslaved populations. And once he became affluent enough, he became a slave holder. And you know what? The Pennsylvania Gazette, the newspaper that he was publishing, he made money off of the slave trade in America. The thing about it is, we don't often hear that story in our American history class because we, in teaching and in engaging with American history, we're often exposed to a whitewashed version of American history. And so we might not know, for instance, that the Pennsylvania Gazette, which was owned by the publisher Benjamin Franklin, one of our most important founding fathers, that it made money off of that slave trade system, off the buying and selling of enslaved Americans. Instead, what we might know is kind of the more redeemable part of Ben Franklin's story, that he became very committed towards the end of his life to ending the slave trade in the United States, the newly formed United States of America, and that he became an ardent abolitionist. That's the part of Ben Franklin's story that we might know, that we might be aware of. But in fact, it's really important to understand Ben Franklin for what he was, which was a white supremacist operating in amongst other white supremacists at this point in time and making money off of the slave trade and benefiting from the labor of enslaved Black Americans at this point in time. So, at any rate, some chapters of American history are more painful to engage with and to encounter than others, but it's really important to always take a second for context. And thank you for joining me in that endeavor today.